He laughed when I said I do. I smiled as I took everything in the divorce. That moment at the altar should have been my first clue. The slight curl of his lip, the barely contained chuckle that escaped as I pledged my life to him. At the time I thought it was just nerves or the emotion of the day. How fucking clueless I was. You know that feeling when your entire life suddenly makes sense in the worst possible way? Like someone just handed you the missing puzzle piece, and suddenly the picture is complete, but it's not the beautiful landscape you thought you were building. It's a giant middle finger aimed right at your face. That's exactly how I felt when I found the email. Capital T, capital E. The email that would end my marriage and start, well, something else entirely. It was a Tuesday. Why do life-altering disasters always happen on Tuesdays? I'd stayed home with a migraine, the kind that makes you pray for the sweet release of death just so the pounding would stop. Daniel had gone to work, supposedly pulling a double shift at the law firm where he was gunning for partner. Such a hard-working husband, everyone always said. So dedicated. His laptop was on the kitchen counter, and it pinged with a new message. I wouldn't normally look. I'm not that person, or at least I wasn't that person. But the sender preview caught my eye. Jessica. Booking confirmation. Jessica. His paralegal. The one he'd mentioned a little too often. The one who always texted him late at night with urgent case questions. The one whose name made him leave the room to answer calls. Some deep animal instinct made me click. It wasn't even snooping if the message popped up on my own kitchen counter, right? Confirmed for next weekend at the Grand Cayman Suite. Same as last month. Can't wait to celebrate your promotion, the way we always do. The migraine instantly vanished, replaced by a ringing silence. You know that moment in movies when someone gets bad news and the director mutes all sound except for a high-pitched tone? Turns out that's not just a cinematic technique. That's your brain short-circuiting as your life implodes. I sat there perfectly still, for what felt like hours but was probably just minutes. Then, with a calm I didn't recognize, I started looking for more. And oh, was there more. Email after email, hotel confirmations going back months, dinner reservations, a fucking recurring calendar event labeled Late Meeting J, every Thursday for the past year. A year. My hands didn't shake. My breathing didn't quicken. I was eerily, unnaturally calm as I scrolled through the digital evidence of my husband's betrayal. I even laughed when I found a receipt for a necklace he'd bought her for Christmas, the same day he told me he couldn't afford the weekend trip I'd wanted to take. Then I found the messages about me. She's clueless. She actually believes I'm working late. I only married her because my parents liked her. Once I make partner, we'll figure something out. And the one that broke through my strange calm, sending a white-hot poker of rage through my chest. Dude, how could you keep a straight face during your vows? I was dying watching you try not to laugh. The response, nearly lost it when she said I do with those puppy dog eyes. Like she thought she'd won some prize. Took everything I had not to crack up right there. He had laughed. On our wedding day. At me. I closed the laptop and walked to our bedroom. Our wedding photo stared back at me from the nightstand. I picked it up, studying his face during what I'd thought was the happiest moment of our lives. And there it was, not a smile of joy but of derision. A man laughing at a joke only he understood. The joke was me. I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I sat on our bed, the bed where he'd slept beside me after being with her, and I began to think. Really think, for the first time in our 5-year relationship, about how he'd isolated me from my friends who weren't good enough, about how he'd convinced me to quit my job because a wife of his stature shouldn't have to work, about how he controlled our finances because I was not good with money, about how he'd talked me out of children because we had plenty of time. I'd given up everything, my career, my independence, my backbone, and for what? To be the punchline of a joke he'd been telling for years? The rage that filled me wasn't hot anymore. It had cooled into something else, something dense and cold and calculating. I looked at myself in the mirror across from our bed. The woman looking back wasn't the same one who'd woken up that morning. She had my face, my eyes, but there was something new behind them. Purpose. I picked up my phone and made an appointment with a divorce attorney for the following day. Then I took 2 of the emergency Xanax I kept for panic attacks, lay down on his side of the bed, and slept more soundly than I had in years. When Daniel came home that night, talking about his exhausting day at the office, I smiled and nodded. I made his favorite dinner. I laughed at his jokes. I even had sex with him, faking enthusiasm while mentally cataloging every asset we owned. He never suspected a thing. Why would he? I was the puppy dog-eyed wife. The punchline. The woman too stupid to question why her husband's business trips always fell on weekends and involved beach destinations. But as he slept beside me that night, snoring softly with the confidence of a man who thinks he's getting away with murder, I made a promise to myself. He had laughed when I said I do. I would smile when I took everything in the divorce. And I meant everything. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm. Before Daniel. Before the sun. My mind was clearer than it had been in years, like someone had taken a squeegee to my brain and wiped away the fog I'd been living in. I studied my husband as he slept, the slight smile on his lips. Was he dreaming of her? His perfectly manicured nails and the wedding band I'd saved for months to buy him, the band that apparently meant jack shit. 5 years together, 3 years married, 1/5 of my life invested in a man who could barely keep from laughing as I pledged my heart to him. What a return on investment. I slipped out of bed and took the longest, hottest shower of my life, letting the scalding water wash away any lingering doubt or weakness. By the time I stepped out, my skin was red and my resolve was iron. The divorce attorney's office was in a part of town Daniel would never visit, too nouveau riche for his old money tastes. The parking lot was full of sensible mid-range cars instead of the luxury vehicles that populated his firm's garage. It felt like coming home somehow. Martina Reynolds had the handshake of someone who'd broken men stronger than my husband. Her office walls were lined with thank you notes from women who looked happier in their after photos than their before. "Tell me everything," she said. So I did. The emails, the year-long affair, the gaslighting, the financial control. With each revelation, her eyebrows climbed higher, and her note-taking became more vigorous. "And what do you want out of this?" she finally asked. I hadn't fully articulated it until that moment, but the answer came with absolute clarity. "Justice," I said. "And by justice, I mean I want to destroy him in exactly the way he'd fear most. Professionally, financially, socially. I want to be the last thing he thinks about at night and the first thing he remembers when he wakes up." Martina's smile could have cut glass. "Then let's talk strategy." The plan she outlined was beautiful in its simplicity. Daniel had made 3 critical mistakes. First, he'd insisted I sign a prenup that protected his family assets, but included a faithfulness clause with substantial penalties. "Just a formality," he'd assured me. "My family insists everyone have one." Second, he'd used his work email for his affair correspondence, the hubris of a man who thinks he's untouchable. Third, he'd commingled our finances just enough that I could make a claim on assets he thought were protected. Careless, so careless. "Don't confront him," Martina advised. "Not yet. We need to gather evidence, secure your position, and prepare for his reaction. Men like Daniel don't lose gracefully." I left her office with a list of tasks that would make a CIA operative sweat. Bank statements, asset inventories, screenshots, recordings, every email, every text, every receipt. But more importantly, I left with something I hadn't had in years: power. I stopped at a coffee shop on the way home and used their Wi-Fi to open a new email account. Then I created new bank accounts at a credit union Daniel would rather die than associate with. I transferred the modest savings from my personal account, the only money he didn't monitor, and set up online access. My phone buzzed. Daniel, checking in, making sure I was where I was supposed to be. I sent a sweet reply about picking up his dry cleaning. He responded with a heart emoji, the same emoji he'd probably sent Jessica after screwing her on our anniversary. The barista called my name. As I reached for my coffee, I caught my reflection in the chrome of the espresso machine. There was a new set to my jaw, a hardness around my eyes that hadn't been there before. I looked for the first time in years like the woman I used to be, the one who didn't take shit from anyone. I missed her. For the next week, I led a double life that would have impressed any spy. By day, I was the perfect, clueless wife, cooking Daniel's meals, laughing at his jokes, feigning headaches to avoid sex I could no longer stomach. By night, I was Martina Reynolds' star pupil, meticulously documenting every piece of evidence, every asset, every vulnerability in Daniel's carefully constructed facade. I discovered credit card statements showing hotel charges in 3 different cities on weekends he was supposedly at legal conferences. I found a secret email account where he and Jessica exchanged photos that would make a porn star blush. I uncovered an offshore account he'd started funding 6 months after our wedding, his escape hatch, I presumed. Each betrayal should have hurt, should have cut me to the quick. But all I felt was a cold satisfaction as each piece of evidence strengthened my position. The real revelation came when I found his personal journal, hidden in a locked drawer in his home office. Daniel, it turned out, was old school when it came to his deepest thoughts. His password was our wedding date. The irony wasn't lost on me. What I read turned my stomach. Not just the detailed accounts of his affair with Jessica, and apparently 2 others before her, but his calculated approach to our entire relationship. He'd pursued me because I was from a good family, but not wealthy enough to challenge him. Because I was attractive enough to look good on his arm, but not so beautiful that I'd attract too much attention. Because I was smart enough to hold a conversation with his colleagues, but insecure enough to be controllable. I had been selected like a show pony, assessed for specific traits that would benefit his image while posing minimal inconvenience to his lifestyle. The most chilling entry was dated the night before our wedding. Final dinner as a free man. Mom thrilled about the match. Dad finally approving. Firm impressed by my settling down. Everything proceeding according to plan. Jay understands the situation. Honeymoon will be tedious but necessary. Back to real life by month's end. Our entire relationship had been a transaction. Our marriage, a business merger. Our love, or what I thought was love, a performance for his audience. I took photos of every page, my hands steady despite the roiling in my gut. Then I carefully replaced the journal exactly as I'd found it and relocked the drawer. That night, as Daniel slept beside me, I allowed myself one moment of true grief, not for the man beside me, but for the woman I'd been, the years I'd lost, the life I'd put on hold. A single tear slid down my cheek. The last tear I would ever shed for Daniel Preston. Tomorrow would bring a new phase in my plan. The gathering was complete. Now it was time to begin the dismantling. The art of taking someone apart isn't taught in schools. There's no Revenge 101. Course that covers the methodical deconstruction of a life built on lies. But as it turns out, I was a natural. 3 weeks into my double life, and I'd developed a system. Every morning I'd kiss Daniel goodbye, my lips barely grazing his cheek. Every evening I'd listen to his stories about the office, nodding at all the right moments while mentally cataloging each lie. And every moment in between, I'd work on dismantling the cage he'd built around me. Martina had become less my attorney and more my general, commanding an invisible army of one, me. The key, she explained during our 3rd meeting, is to make him think everything is normal until it absolutely isn't. The conference room at her office had become my war room. Financial statements and legal documents spread across the table like battle plans, my phone recording every word as she laid out the strategy. Your husband has 3 vulnerabilities. Martina continued, ticking them off on her manicured fingers. His professional reputation, his family's approval, and his money, in that order. I nodded, sipping the expensive coffee she always ordered for our meetings. The coffee, Daniel would say, was a waste of money. Amazing how the smallest freedoms now tasted so sweet. We've documented the affair extensively, she said with a slight smirk. The faithfulness clause in your prenup is ironclad. His family's old-fashioned enough that an affair with a subordinate would be problematic, especially with proof he used company resources to conduct it, I added. Martina's smile widened. Exactly. But timing is everything. If we move too soon, he'll have time to spin the narrative. If we wait too long, he might get suspicious. The plan we developed was elegant in its brutality. We would strike at the moment of his greatest triumph, the partnership announcement at his firm, scheduled for exactly 1 month away. The pinnacle of everything he'd been working toward. The reason he'd needed a perfect wife in the first place. What about his parents? I asked. The elder Prestons had always treated me with the mechanical politeness reserved for household staff, necessary but ultimately replaceable. That's your call, Martina said, leaning back. How personal do you want this to get? I considered the question. Daniel's relationship with his parents was complex, desperate for approval yet resentful of their expectations. They'd pushed him toward law when he'd wanted business. They'd insisted on a suitable wife when he'd preferred playing the field. They held the purse strings to his trust fund, which wouldn't fully vest until he made partner. Everything, I said finally. He took everything from me. My career, my confidence. Years I can never get back. I want his parents to see him exactly as he is. Martina nodded, making a note. Then we'll need to approach this carefully. The Prestons aren't just wealthy, they're influential. We don't want them circling the wagons to protect him. His mother collects social causes, I said, an idea forming. Empowering women in the workplace is her current favorite. Martina's eyebrow arched. Now that has potential. We spent the next hour refining the plan, identifying potential obstacles, preparing for Daniel's likely countermoves. By the time we finished, I had a timeline, a script, and a newfound sense of purpose that bordered on exhilaration. On my way home, I stopped at a boutique I'd always admired but never entered, the prices too extravagant for the allowance Daniel deemed appropriate for a woman who didn't even work. I bought a dress, red, fitted, nothing like the conservative clothes that filled my closet. The saleswoman smiled as she wrapped it. "Special occasion? You could say that," I replied. "It's for a demolition." She looked confused but rang me up anyway. I paid with cash, another new habit. Cash didn't leave a digital trail for Daniel to monitor. That night, I made his favorite meal and listened to him drone on about the partnership committee's deliberations, about how Jessica had really stepped up to help with his presentation, about how his mother had already planned a celebration dinner at the country club. "You don't mind if it's just family for the dinner, right?" he asked, not looking up from his plate. "It's more of a professional thing." "You'd be bored." "Of course," I said, the lie sliding easily from my lips. "Whatever makes the evening special for you." He smiled, reaching across to pat my hand like you might pat a dog for performing a simple trick. "This is why I married you. You always understand these things." I smiled back, thinking of the red dress hanging in the back of my closet, thinking of the evidence compiled in a secure cloud folder, thinking of the look that would cross his face when he realized who I really was. "I do understand," I said. "Better than you can imagine." The next phase required something I'd been avoiding, reconnecting with old friends. Not just for the plan, but for me, for the woman I was becoming again. The woman who had existed before Daniel. It was harder than I expected. Shame is a powerful isolator. How do you call someone after years of silence and say, "Remember me? The friend who disappeared because my controlling husband thought you were a bad influence? Want to grab coffee?" But I did it, starting with Mia, my old roommate from college. The one Daniel had called too aggressive, because she'd had the audacity to question why I'd quit my job. We met at a cafe far from Daniel's usual haunts. The moment she saw me, her eyes widened, then narrowed. I'd prepared an explanation, an apology, but before I could speak, she'd wrapped me in a hug so fierce it nearly broke my composure. "I knew it," she whispered. "I fucking knew he was bad news." Over the next hour, I told her everything. The affair, the gaslighting, the control. The plan. By the end, she was gripping her coffee cup so tightly I feared it might shatter. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "A witness," I said. "Someone who knew me before. Someone who can testify to who I was and what he did to change me." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Consider it done." One by one, I reconnected with the people I'd left behind. My former boss. My college friends, even my younger sister, who'd been so hurt by my gradual disappearance from her life that she'd stopped trying to contact me altogether. Each conversation was painful. Each reunion laid bare the extent of what I'd lost. But each person also became a thread in the new web I was weaving, a support system Daniel had never anticipated I could rebuild. And with each conversation, I felt myself growing stronger, the fog of his manipulation lifting further. The boundaries of my world expanding beyond the narrow confines he'd established. I was becoming dangerous. 3 days before the partnership announcement, I met with Martina for our final preparation. Everything was in place. The evidence compiled. The witnesses prepared. The timing coordinated down to the minute. "Are you ready?" she asked, studying my face. I thought about Daniel's laugh at the altar, about the puppy dog eyes comment, about the years stolen, about the children we never had because they didn't fit his timeline. "I've been ready since the moment I found that email," I said. "He's the one who isn't ready." Martina nodded, satisfied. "Then let's go over the sequence one more time." As she reviewed the plan, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't about passion or rage anymore. This was justice. Cold, calculated justice. He had laughed when I said "I do." Soon, I would be the one smiling, and his world would never be the same. I spent the final days before D-Day, Demolition Day, as I'd started calling it in my head, in a state of hyper-awareness. Colors seemed brighter, sounds clearer. Every one of Daniel's little habits, the way he cleared his throat before lying, how he checked his work, phone under the table during dinner, registered like neon signs pointing to his deception. How had I ever missed these tells? The morning of the partnership announcement, Daniel was practically vibrating with self-importance. He spent an extra 20 minutes on his hair, selected his power tie, a Hermes monstrosity his mother had given him, and practiced his acceptance smile in the bathroom mirror. I made his favorite breakfast and told him how proud I was, how he deserved this recognition, how tonight would change everything. On that last point, at least, I wasn't lying. He kissed me goodbye, a distracted peck that barely grazed my cheek, and headed out the door, completely oblivious to the fact that it was the last time he'd see me as the compliant, adoring wife he thought he'd married. The moment his car pulled away, I sprang into action. First call, Martina. Everything was set. The package had been delivered to the managing partners first thing this morning, documentation of Daniel's affair with his subordinate, including the inappropriate use of company resources and time. A separate file had gone to HR. The evidence was damning, clinical, and impossible to dismiss as mere jealousy or misunderstanding. Daniel wouldn't know any of this until the moment he stood to accept his partnership, the moment that should have been his crowning achievement. Instead, it would be the beginning of his professional funeral. Second call, Mia. She and my other friends were prepared for their roles, social media posts precisely timed to coincide with the fallout, each revealing a different aspect of Daniel's controlling behavior over the years. Not as legal evidence, but as public context. The court of public opinion can be just as devastating as a legal one. Third call, the movers. They arrived 30 minutes later, efficient, discreet professionals who'd been well briefed on exactly what to take and what to leave. My personal belongings, family heirlooms, the specific items listed in my pre-marriage assets that Daniel had always claimed really pulled the room together. I supervised from the kitchen island, sipping the expensive whiskey he saved for special guests. Translation, important men he wanted to impress. With each box that left the house, I felt lighter, the weight of false obligation sliding from my shoulders. By noon, everything I wanted was gone, leaving strategic empty spaces throughout the house, spaces Daniel would notice immediately. The art piece from my grandmother, the antique desk I'd restored before we met, my great-aunt's silver service that he'd always positioned prominently during dinner parties, despite calling it tacky when we were alone. I changed into the red dress, applied makeup with more care than I had in years, and slipped on heels I could actually walk in rather than the conservative pumps Daniel preferred. The woman in the mirror looked both familiar and new, a version of myself I'd glimpsed before but never fully embraced. This woman was dangerous. This woman was free. I took one last look around the house that had been my prison, picked up my purse, and walked out. I didn't lock the door. I wouldn't be needing my key anymore. The law firm of Preston, Wilmot, and Stern occupied 3 floors in a glass tower downtown, the kind of place with marble lobbies and receptionists who looked like they'd stepped out of fashion magazines. I'd always felt underdressed here, intimidated by the sleek efficiency and unstated wealth. Not today. I strode through the lobby at precisely 3:45 p.m., timing my arrival with military precision. The partnership announcement ceremony would begin at 4 o'clock. Daniel would be called up at approximately 4:20, after the managing partner's speeches but before the champagne toast. The receptionist recognized me immediately, her professional smile tinged with confusion. Mrs. Preston rarely visited without her husband. Mrs. Preston certainly never visited wearing red dresses with necklines like that. I informed her I was surprising Daniel for his big moment. She made a call, then directed me to the conference floor where the ceremony was being held. Perfect. The elevator ride gave me 15 seconds of solitude to center myself. I could feel my heart pounding, not with anxiety but with anticipation, like an athlete before a race or a predator before a strike. The conference room doors were open, the space already filled with partners, associates, and support staff. At the front, behind a small podium, stood the managing partners. To the side, looking smugly expectant, was Daniel, and next to him, looking nervous but excited, was Jessica. How convenient. The full cast was assembled for the final act. I didn't immediately approach. Instead, I positioned myself near the back, accepting a champagne flute from a passing server. A few people noticed me, eyebrows raising at both my presence and my appearance, but no one approached. I was still Daniel's wife, a known but separate entity in this world. Martin Wilmot, the senior partner, began his speech about excellence and tradition and the future of the firm. I took a small sip of champagne, savoring the bubbles on my tongue. Across the room I caught sight of Daniel's parents entering, his mother in her signature pearls, his father looking politely bored. All the pieces on the board. I felt my phone vibrate. A text from Martina. Package received and reviewed by management. Green light? Then another from Mia. Social countdown initiated. Ready when you are? The final message came from an unexpected source, Daniel's mother. 3 days ago, I'd sent her a private message with very specific evidence of her son's behavior. Not everything. I'd curated a selection tailored to her particular sensibilities. Things that would offend her sense of propriety rather than inspire defensive maternal protection. Her message was brief. I've spoken with your attorney. We will not contest anything. Some sins cannot be excused even from a son. I slipped my phone back into my purse as Martin Wilmot's speech wound down. He paused, taking a sip of water, and something in his expression changed. A tightening around the eyes, a slight adjustment to his posture. Before we continue with tonight's announcements, he said, his voice taking on a new formality, I need to address a matter that has just come to the attention of the partnership committee. Daniel's smile faltered slightly. Confusion flickered across his face, and that's when I began walking forward. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a steady, confident pace that parted the crowd like a hot knife through butter. People turned to look, then kept looking. This wasn't the Daniel's mousy wife they were accustomed to seeing at the occasional firm dinner. I felt his eyes find me about halfway to the front, watched the progression of emotions cross his face. Surprise, confusion, alarm, the beginnings of comprehension. By the time I reached the front row, standing directly in his line of sight, Martin Wilmot was explaining that certain allegations had emerged that required immediate investigation. Daniel's face had drained of color. His eyes darted from Wilmot to me, to Jessica, who looked increasingly panicked, to his stone-faced parents, and I smiled. Not a big smile, not a gloating grin. Just a small, satisfied curve of my lips that said more clearly than words ever could, I know everything. And now, so does everyone else. The carefully constructed world he'd built began to crumble before my eyes, and all I felt was a profound sense of justice, finally, perfectly served. He had laughed when I said I do. Now I was smiling as I took everything away, starting with the thing he valued most, his reputation. The firm's conference room transformed into a theater of chaos. Partners murmuring urgently to one another, associates pretending not to stare while absorbing every detail, support staff suddenly finding urgent reasons to linger, and at the center of it all, Daniel, my soon-to-be ex-husband, looking like he'd been hit by a bus he never saw coming. Martin Wilmot's voice cut through the growing commotion. In light of these serious allegations, the partnership announcement for Daniel Preston is suspended pending a full investigation. Daniel lunged toward the podium, desperation breaking through his carefully cultivated composure. This is a mistake. There must be some misunderstanding. Wilmot held up his hand, his face a mask of professional regret tinged with disgust. Not here, Daniel. My office. Now. Jessica had gone deathly pale, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. When they landed on me, I raised my champagne glass in a small toast. Her shoulders slumped as understanding dawned. The room had become a pressure cooker, everyone sensing they were witnessing something monumental, but not quite grasping the full picture. Daniel's eyes found mine, and for a brief moment, I saw something I'd never witnessed in him before. Fear. Good. He should be afraid. His parents stood rigid near the entrance, his mother's knuckles white around her clutch purse, his father's jaw clenched so tight I could almost hear his expensive dental work creaking. They made no move to approach their son, no gesture of support. They simply watched, two statues of disapproval observing the downfall of their dynasty's latest hope. Daniel was escorted from the room by Wilmot and two other senior partners. As he passed me, he hissed, "What the fuck did you do?" I didn't answer. The evidence spoke for itself, and I wasn't here to give him a convenient target for his rage. I was here to witness. The moment the door closed behind them, my phone buzzed. Phase 2 initiated. Across social media platforms, my carefully coordinated truth bomb was detonating. Mia sharing her account of how Daniel had systematically isolated me. My former boss detailing how Daniel had pressured me to quit my promising career. My sister posting old texts showing how he'd manipulated me into missing family events. Each post tagged with the firm's name, each story more damning than the last. Jessica fled the room, phone clutched to her ear, mascara already smudging beneath her eyes. I wondered if she was calling Daniel, not realizing he was otherwise occupied. Or perhaps she was calling her own attorney. She'd need one, given the firm's strict policies about interoffice relationships, especially between superiors and subordinates. I finished my champagne, set down the glass, and prepared to leave. My part here was done. But as I turned, I found myself face to face with Eleanor Preston, Daniel's mother, her posture as rigid as ever but something new in her eyes. "You could have come to us," she said, her voice pitched low enough that only I could hear. I met her gaze steadily. "Would you have believed me?" The slight flinch told me everything I needed to know. She wouldn't have. Not without the evidence I'd compiled, not without the brutal undeniability of it all laid bare. "The divorce terms," she continued. "We won't contest them. But the family name—" "I don't want your name," I interrupted. "I just want what's mine, what I earned by enduring years married to your son." Something like respect flickered across her features. She gave a nearly imperceptible nod and stepped aside, clearing my path to the exit. I walked out of that conference room with my head high, feeling the weight of every stare, the hum of every whispered conversation. Not as Daniel's wife, not as a victim, but as the architect of a reckoning. The lobby felt different now. Less intimidating, more like any other building I might pass through. The marble and glass had lost their power to make me feel small. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight caught the edge of my wedding ring. I slipped it off, weighing it in my palm for a moment. 3 carats, platinum band, custom design. Daniel had called it an investment in our future. Now it represented nothing but a contract voided by betrayal. I dropped it into the donation box of a homeless shelter 2 blocks from the firm. Someone might get a meal out of Daniel's investment. My new apartment welcomed me with blessed silence. No ticking grandfather clocks, no echoing hallways, no ghost of Daniel's expectations haunting every room. Just 800 square feet of space that was entirely mine, filled only with things I had chosen. I kicked off my heels and opened my laptop. The fallout was spreading faster than even Martina had predicted. Industry blogs were already picking up the story of the suspended partnership announcement, though they were still short on specifics. That wouldn't last. In this city, legal gossip traveled at light speed. My phone rang. "Martina. He's been placed on administrative leave," she said without preamble. "The firm is in full damage control mode. His office is being packed up as we speak." I let that sink in. The office he'd spent countless hours in, neglecting our marriage while simultaneously betraying it. The office he'd been so proud of, with its corner view and pretentious art. And Jessica? Also suspended. HR is pulling their communication records. It's not looking good for either of them. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. His parents? They've already had their lawyer contact me. They're willing to accept all terms as presented. They just want this over with minimal publicity. She paused. This never happens, you know. The wealthy family that rolls over without a fight. They care more about their reputation than they care about him, I said. Always have. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine. A cheap red I actually enjoyed, not the expensive vintages Daniel insisted on that always gave me a headache. I scrolled through my phone, watching the dominoes continue to fall. 3 missed calls from Daniel. 5 text messages, evolving from confusion to rage to desperate bargaining. I deleted them all unread and blocked his number. He would be served with divorce papers tomorrow at 9 a.m. The faithfulness clause in our prenup would be triggered, entitling me to 30% of his assets rather than the 10% standard division. His parents would not contest my claim to the vacation home in Vermont that I'd spent 2 years renovating while he was working late. The art collection we'd built together, primarily pieces I'd selected that he'd claimed to appreciate, would be liquidated and divided. By this time tomorrow, Daniel Preston would understand what it meant to lose everything he valued. I curled up on my new sofa, a comfortable, slightly worn piece I'd found at a consignment shop, nothing like the museum-quality furniture that had filled our marital home, and felt something bubble up inside me. It took me a moment to recognize it. Laughter. Not bitter, not hysterical. Just pure, genuine laughter at the perfect symmetry of it all. He had laughed when I said I do. Now I was laughing as I said I'm done. The next 3 days unfolded like the most satisfying slow-motion sequence in a revenge movie. You know, the part where the villain finally realizes they're completely and utterly fucked. I woke up the morning after the partnership implosion to 17 missed calls and 1 very official email from the firm's HR department requesting an interview about the workplace misconduct allegations. Apparently, once they started digging into Daniel's communications, they found even more than what I'd provided. Shocker. Martina called mid-morning with updates that made me wish I had popcorn on hand. Daniel was served with the divorce papers at his parents' house, she reported, not bothering to hide the satisfaction in her voice. Apparently he tried to go back to your house last night and found his key didn't work. I smiled into my coffee cup. The locksmith had been expensive, but worth every penny. How'd he take it? I asked, though I could pretty much guess. According to our process server, he went through the 5 stages of grief in about 30 seconds flat, except he got stuck on anger. Called you several colorful names. I'm sure bitch was the kindest of them. Not even close. Martina chuckled. The good news is his tantrum happened in front of his parents, which didn't help his case with them. The divorce papers were a masterpiece of legal brutality. Every infidelity documented, every financial deception noted. Every asset cataloged and claimed according to the terms of our prenup's faithfulness clause. The clause he'd insisted on, convinced that if anyone was going to cheat, it would be me. The irony was almost poetic. By mid-afternoon, I'd received flowers from Mia with a card that simply read, "Queen shit," and a bottle of champagne from my sister who promised to visit the following weekend. My phone buzzed with supportive messages from the friends I'd reconnected with, each one a thread weaving me back into a social fabric I'd been cut from. I spent the day setting up my new apartment, hanging art where I wanted it, arranging furniture that prioritized comfort over appearance, and building the beginnings of a life that reflected me instead of someone else's expectations. Around 6, my phone rang with an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. You've destroyed my life. Daniel's voice was tight, controlled rage vibrating beneath the surface. Are you happy now? I considered hanging up, but something made me stay on the line. Maybe I wanted him to hear the lack of fear in my voice. Maybe I needed him to understand exactly how completely he'd lost. Actually, yes, I replied calmly. I am happy now, for the first time in years. The firm is investigating me. Jessica isn't speaking to me. My parents are threatening to cut me off. His voice cracked slightly. What the fuck am I supposed to do now? The audacity was almost impressive. Almost. I don't know, Daniel. Maybe try not being a cheating, gaslighting asshole who laughs at his wife while saying wedding vows? Just a thought. This isn't who you are, he said, switching tactics. You're not vindictive. You're not cruel. You're right. I agreed. I wasn't those things. But then again, you didn't really know me at all, did you? You knew the version of me you created, compliant, insecure, desperate for approval. That woman never really existed. We can work this out. He tried, desperation seeping into his tone. Couples therapy. A fresh start. I'll stop seeing Jessica. I actually laughed then. Daniel, I wouldn't take you back if you were the last man on Earth and the survival of humanity depended on it. I'd let the species die out. You can't do this to me. I already have. Don't call this number again. I hung up and blocked that number too. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. I felt nothing but a serene certainty that I'd done exactly what needed to be done. The next morning brought news that the firm had expanded its investigation to include potential financial improprieties. Apparently, Daniel had been charging personal expenses related to his affair as business costs, hotel rooms listed as client meetings, dinners categorized as business development. Amateur move, really. By the end of the week, the legal community was buzzing with rumors. I knew because former colleagues began reaching out, ostensibly to check on me but really to fish for details. I gave them nothing but gracious thanks for their concern. No need to feed the gossip machine directly. It was running just fine on its own. 10 days after D-Day, I met Martina for coffee to discuss the upcoming divorce hearing. The firm had asked for my discretion regarding their internal investigation, offering a generous confidentiality agreement in exchange for my cooperation. I signed it without hesitation, not because I needed their money, but because I didn't need to destroy the entire firm to get justice from Daniel. His attorney finally responded to our settlement proposal, Martina said, sliding a folder across the table. They're not contesting the division of assets as outlined, but they've asked for a non-disclosure agreement. I raised an eyebrow. He wants me to stay quiet about his cheating? More specifically, he doesn't want details of the affair with Jessica becoming public record. I suspect he's trying to salvage what's left of his career prospects. Once he's officially terminated from the firm, which is inevitable at this point, he'll need to find another position. I considered this. The NDA wouldn't prevent what had already happened, but it would limit what I could say going forward. What's he offering in exchange? Martina's smile was shark-like. The lake house. All of it, not just your half. The lake house. The only property Daniel had inherited directly from his grandfather, bypassing his parents' control. The one asset he'd sworn would never be part of any divorce settlement because it was family legacy. He must be desperate, I mused. Extremely. His father has apparently frozen his access to family funds pending the outcome of all this. He's living on savings and rapidly running out of friends willing to help him. I tapped my fingers thoughtfully on the table. Accept the NDA, but with conditions. I want it clearly stated that I can discuss the divorce and the fact that he cheated, just not specific names or details of the affair. And I want written acknowledgement that he violated the faithfulness clause in the prenup. Punishment and vindication in one package. Martina nodded approvingly. I'll draft it this afternoon. That evening, I treated myself to dinner at a restaurant Daniel had always dismissed as trying too hard to be authentic. The pasta was delicious, the wine unpretentious, and the lack of judgment about dining alone refreshingly civilized. As I waited for my check, a man at the bar caught my eye and raised his glass slightly. Attractive, around my age, with an open smile that reached his eyes. For a brief, disorienting moment, I felt a flicker of interest. Not because I was ready to date, but because I recognized that someday I might be. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at clear water below. The jump would be scary, but the swim would be worth it. I smiled politely but not encouragingly and turned away. I wasn't ready for that cliff yet. I was still building myself back up, still discovering who I was without Daniel's constant presence warping my self-perception. But for the first time, I could envision a future where I might be ready. 3 weeks after D-Day, the divorce was finalized in what must have been record time for our state. Daniel's desperation to contain the damage and his parents' desire to wash their hands of the mess had expedited what could have been a drawn-out process. I walked out of the courthouse with my maiden name restored, a settlement that made my financial advisor whistle appreciatively, and a sense of lightness I hadn't felt in years. No more pretending, no more walking on eggshells, no more measuring my worth through someone else's warped estimation. That night, I sat on the small balcony of my apartment, watching the city lights flicker on as dusk settled. My phone pinged with a news alert from the legal industry newsletter I still subscribed to. Preston, Wilmot & Stern announces organizational changes. Daniel Preston no longer with the firm. I didn't need to read the rest. The firm had obviously cushioned his exit with careful language, but everyone in the industry would understand what it meant. His career, at least in this city, was effectively over. I closed the alert and opened my email instead, finding the confirmation I'd been waiting for. My application to graduate school had been accepted. The business degree I'd abandoned when Daniel convinced me to focus on being his wife was back within reach. It was a strange feeling, this mixture of vindication and rebirth. The satisfaction of watching Daniel's life implode was undeniably sweet, but it wasn't the real victory. The real win was sitting here, planning my own future without his shadow looming over every choice. He had laughed when I said I do. I had smiled as I took everything in the divorce. But now, alone on my balcony with a future stretching open before me, I wasn't just smiling. I was finally genuinely happy. 6 months after the divorce, my life had transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined on that Tuesday when I'd found the email. My apartment was no longer just a temporary refuge, but a genuine home. Plants thrived on every windowsill, actual living things I managed to keep alive. Unlike my marriage. The walls displayed artwork I'd created in a painting class I'd joined on a whim. Nothing expensive or impressive, just splashes of color that made me smile when I looked at them. Graduate school consumed most of my weekdays, challenging in all the best ways, stretching mental muscles that had atrophied during my years as Daniel's perfectly curated wife. My classmates were a decade younger, but they'd accepted the divorce comeback kid. Their term, not mine, without judgment. One of them had even convinced me to join their study group, which often devolved into wine and pizza after the actual studying was done. The lake house had become my weekend sanctuary. I'd replaced the pretentious furniture with comfortable pieces that could handle wet swimsuits and muddy boots. The liquor cabinet now held local craft beers instead of the expensive scotch Daniel had used to impress his equally insufferable friends. My sister brought her kids up monthly, filling the place with the chaotic energy of children, something Daniel had always said would ruin the ambiance. I was building a life that actually fit me, rather than contorting myself to fit someone else's expectations. Financial security was a welcome bonus. Between the divorce settlement, my half of our investments, plus the infidelity penalty, and the lake house, I had more than enough to fund my education and still live comfortably. Daniel's parents had honored their word, raising no objections to the settlement terms. In fact, apart from one tersely polite email confirming the transfer of the lake house deed, I'd had no contact with them since that day at the firm. Daniel himself had left the city, from what I'd heard. Rumors placed him at a much smaller firm in another state, presumably hired by someone who owed his father a favor. Jessica had apparently landed on her feet at a competing firm, having negotiated her own exit package by threatening a sexual harassment suit. Good for her, honestly. Daniel had been the villain in our respective stories, not her. I hadn't thought about him in weeks, which felt like its own kind of victory. Until today. The invitation had arrived by email, the annual charity gala for the Legal Aid Foundation. In previous years, I'd attended as Daniel's accessory, wearing whatever he deemed appropriate, speaking only when spoken to, essentially functioning as a walking, talking testimony to his success as a family man. This year, I'd been invited in my own right, as a donor. I'd given a portion of my settlement to the foundation, specifying that it funds services for women rebuilding their lives after leaving abusive relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me, nor was it lost on the foundation director who'd called personally to thank me. I decided to go, not to prove anything to anyone else, but to prove something to myself, that I could re-enter that world on my own terms, without anxiety, without shame. I bought a dress, emerald green, backless, nothing like the conservative sheaths Daniel had preferred. Did my hair the way I liked it, not the way he'd insisted looked more professional. Wore jewelry I'd bought myself with my own money. The venue was the same as always, one of those grand old hotels with crystal chandeliers and carpet thick enough to muffle any uncomfortable truths. I handed my coat to the attendant and took a steadying breath before entering the ballroom. It was strange how quickly the familiar became unfamiliar when viewed through new eyes. The same people circulated with the same practiced smiles, making the same carefully calibrated small talk. But now I could see it for the performance it was, rather than the reality I'd once desperately tried to belong to. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and found myself approached by Martin Wilmot's wife, Catherine, who had always treated me with the particular kindness reserved for those she considered less fortunate than herself. "My dear," she said, air-kissing near my cheek, "you look absolutely transformed. Divorce clearly agrees with you." "It really does?" I replied with genuine warmth. "Best diet I've ever tried. Lose 180 pounds of dead weight instantly." She laughed with real surprise, then lowered her voice. "I always thought you were too good for him, you know. Too authentic." "Thank you," I said, though I doubted the sincerity of her retroactive support. "How is Martin? Busy as ever?" "The firm has finally settled after all that unpleasantness." She gave me a look that tried to communicate sympathy but landed closer to curiosity. "Have you heard anything from Daniel?" "Not a word," I said truthfully. "And that's exactly how I prefer it." I circulated through the room, surprised by how many people seemed genuinely pleased to see me. Former spouses of lawyers were typically treated as ghosts at these functions, present but not acknowledged, lest divorce prove contagious. Yet here I was, fielding introductions and engaging in conversations where people actually listened to my responses. I was chatting with one of the foundation board members about their new initiatives when I felt it, that distinctive prickle at the back of my neck that signals you're being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the crowd, and there he was, Daniel, standing near the entrance, looking like he'd aged a decade in 6 months. Our eyes met across the room and time seemed to compress. Every moment of our relationship, from that first meeting where he'd seemed so charming, to our wedding day when he'd struggled not to laugh, to that final confrontation, flashed between us like a toxic highlight reel. He looked away first. The board member was still talking, unaware of the silent exchange that had just occurred. I forced myself to re-engage, to nod at appropriate intervals while my mind raced. What was he doing here? Last I'd heard, he was living 3 states away. Had he been invited? Was he someone's plus one? Was this some pathetic attempt to reclaim his former social standing? 20 minutes later, as I was getting another drink at the bar, I felt someone approach. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. The expensive cologne, the one I'd always complained gave me headaches, announced him before he spoke. "You look well," Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral. I turned slowly, taking my time, appreciating how this small act of ignoring him would irritate the man who'd always demanded immediate attention. "Thank you." I replied, giving him the brief, polite smile I'd perfected for unwanted conversations at cocktail parties. I am well. He looked terrible, actually. His suit was still expensive, but fit poorly, as though he'd lost weight. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and tension lines had deepened around his mouth. I didn't expect to see you here, he continued when I offered nothing more. I was invited, I said simply, as a donor. His expression flickered, surprise, then something harder to identify. With my money. I laughed then, genuinely amused by his persistent self-absorption. No, Daniel. With the money I was legally entitled to after you violated our marriage contract by screwing your paralegal. There's a difference. A muscle twitched in his jaw. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened. I haven't, I interrupted, surprising myself with the truth of it. I've been too busy building my new life to dwell on why my old one imploded. He stared at me, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No anger, no vindication, no satisfaction at his obvious downfall. Just nothing. He had become irrelevant to my story. I should get back to my date, I said, though I'd come alone. Enjoy the evening. I walked away without looking back, weaving through the crowd toward the terrace doors. Outside, the night air was cool and clarifying. I leaned against the stone balustrade, looking out over the city lights, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The encounter should have felt momentous, facing my betrayer, the man who'd nearly destroyed me. Instead, it felt like closing a book I'd already finished reading. The story was over. I knew how it ended. There was nothing more to discover. As if punctuating this realization, my phone buzzed with a text from Mia. How's the fancy lawyer party? Boring as expected? I smiled, typing back. Just had a Daniel sighting. Felt nothing. Progress? Her reply was immediate. Massive progress. Drinks after to celebrate your immunity to asshole ex-husbands? Absolutely. I'll bring the champagne. I slipped my phone back into my clutch and took one more moment to enjoy the night air before returning to the gala. There were people inside I actually wanted to talk to, connections worth making, an evening worth enjoying on my own terms. And if I happened to cross paths with Daniel again, I'd treat him exactly as he deserved, with the polite indifference reserved for people who no longer matter. 2 hours later, I was at Mia's apartment, shoes kicked off, makeup slightly smudged, laughing harder than I had in months as we dissected the evening with clinical precision and excessive wine. So he just stood there? Mia asked incredulously. No grand apology? No begging for forgiveness? Nothing that dramatic, I confirmed, refilling our glasses. Just the sad, awkward attempt of a man trying to reclaim some dignity from the woman who saw through all his bullshit. God, I wish I could have seen his face when you walked in looking like an absolute queen while he looked like weak old trash. I laughed, but something made me pause. You know what's weird? I thought seeing him suffer would be the best part of all this. The revenge, the justice. But actually the best part is that I genuinely don't care anymore. His happiness or misery has nothing to do with me. Mia raised her glass. That, my friend, is what they call healing. We clinked glasses, and I let the truth of her words sink in. This was healing, not the absence of pain, but the presence of something better. A life rebuilt on my terms. Friendships rekindled. Possibilities unfolding. Later that night, as I let myself into my apartment, I caught my reflection in the entryway mirror. The woman looking back at me was so different from the one who had discovered her husband's betrayal all those months ago. Her eyes were clearer, her shoulders straighter, her smile genuine. I thought about the journey, from devastation to calculation to execution to liberation. Each phase necessary, each step leading me here. He had laughed when I said, I do, thinking he'd trapped a naive woman in a marriage of convenience. I had smiled as I took everything in the divorce, believing that justice was the ultimate goal. But now I understood the real victory wasn't what I'd taken from him, but what I'd reclaimed for myself. My voice, my choices, my future. And that was worth more than everything else combined. 1 year and 7 months after D-Day, I stood on the stage at my business school graduation, accepting my MBA with distinction. As the dean shook my hand and cameras flashed, I caught sight of Mia and my sister in the audience, hollering like we were at a rock concert instead of a dignified academic ceremony. My study group, now my closest friends, whistled and cheered from the graduate section. Even my former boss had shown up, proudly waving like he'd personally taught me everything I knew. This moment had nothing to do with Daniel and everything to do with me, yet I couldn't help but appreciate the symmetry. The last time I'd stood before a crowd accepting something life-changing had been my wedding day, the day he'd laughed as I said, "I do." Now here I was, accepting the future I'd built for myself, surrounded by people who genuinely celebrated my success. Life has a poetry to it if you're patient enough to wait for the rhymes. The after-party at my apartment was gloriously chaotic, champagne flowing, graduation caps being worn by people who definitely hadn't graduated, music loud enough that my normally reserved neighbor actually smiled when we passed in the hallway. I'd become known for these gatherings, warm, unpretentious celebrations where everyone was welcome and no one was being judged on their wine selection or conversational pedigree. To the graduate, Mia toasted, raising her glass. Who proved that the best revenge isn't just living well, it's living authentically. And making bank while doing it, added Jason, my study partner who'd become something of a brother during our late-night cram sessions. Don't forget to mention us little people in your first CEO speech. I laughed, soaking in the moment. Bold of you to assume I'd remember any of you once I'm rich and powerful. The job offer had come 3 weeks earlier, a startup focused on financial literacy for women, particularly those rebuilding after divorce or loss. The founder had heard me speak at a campus event about my own financial journey and approached me immediately after. The salary was good, the equity options better, and the purpose behind it all felt like the perfect alignment of my experience and ambition. Later, as the party wound down and only my closest circle remained, sprawled across my living room furniture in various states of champagne-induced relaxation, my sister asked the question I'd been getting a lot lately. So, any interesting romantic prospects, or are you still enjoying your independence too much? I rolled my eyes, though there was no real annoyance behind it. Can a woman not enjoy her graduation day without having her relationship status interrogated? That's a very elaborate way of saying no, Mia observed, grinning into her glass. It's not a no, I corrected. It's a none of your business yet. The truth was both simpler and more complicated. There had been dates, some terrible, some pleasant, none earth-shattering. I'd had a brief fling with a visiting professor from Europe that was exactly what I needed at the time. Uncomplicated, honest, and with a built-in expiration date when he returned to London. But the real relationship I'd been focused on was the one with myself. Learning to trust my own judgment again. Discovering what I actually liked versus what I'd convinced myself to like during my marriage. Building a life that wasn't reaction or rebellion, but authentic creation. Fine, keep your secrets, my sister conceded. But whoever he is, he better understand that you come with an entire security detail of overprotective friends now. Damn straight, Jason agreed, raising his glass in solidarity. I smiled, feeling that specific warmth that comes from being genuinely known and loved. These people had seen me at my strategic, calculating worst and my vulnerable, rebuilding best, and they'd stuck around for both versions. 2 weeks later, I was settling into my new office when my assistant, I had an assistant now, still couldn't quite wrap my head around that, poked her head in. There's a call for you on line 2. Eleanor Preston. I froze, coffee mug halfway to my lips. Eleanor Preston. Daniel's mother. We hadn't spoken since that brief exchange at the partnership ceremony over a year and a half ago. Did she say what it's regarding? I asked, buying time while my brain raced through possibilities. Just that it's personal, not business. I nodded, set down my mug, and picked up the phone. This is Alexis. I'd reclaimed my maiden name the day after the divorce was finalized, shedding Preston like an ill-fitting coat. Alexis? Eleanor's voice was exactly as I remembered, precisely modulated to convey authority without appearing aggressive. Thank you for taking my call. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Not at all. I lied smoothly. What can I do for you, Mrs. Preston? Eleanor, please. A pause. I'll get straight to the point. I'm in town for a charity board meeting and wondered if you might be available for lunch tomorrow. Of all the scenarios I'd imagined, a lunch invitation hadn't been among them. May I ask why? Another pause, longer this time. There are some matters I'd like to discuss in person. Nothing concerning the divorce settlement, she added quickly. More personal matters. Curiosity won out over caution. All right. There's a cafe near my office. Noon? We confirmed details, and I hung up feeling slightly disoriented. What could Eleanor Preston possibly want to discuss after all this time? The divorce was long settled. Daniel was completely out of my life. There were no loose ends that I could think of. I texted Mia. Guess who just invited me to lunch? Daniel's mother. Her reply was immediate. What? Why? Are you going? Yes. Tomorrow. Curious what she wants. Want me to sit at a nearby table as backup? I make an excellent spy. I smiled at my phone. Tempting, but I can handle Eleanor Preston. That's what you said about that extra spicy curry last month, and I ended up holding your hair while you puked. Fair point. But I'm still going alone. The cafe I'd chosen was intentionally public, plenty of witnesses if things got uncomfortable, but not so busy that our conversation would be overheard. I arrived 10 minutes early and selected a table with a good view of the entrance. Eleanor arrived precisely on time, dressed in her signature understated elegance, a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first car, pearls that had likely been in her family for generations, and a handbag that screamed old money without actually raising its voice. She spotted me immediately, her expression giving nothing away as she approached. I stood to greet her, and we exchanged the most awkward air kiss in the history of society lunches. You look well, she said, taking the seat across from me. I've been following your career with interest. The MBA, your new position? Very impressive. Thank you, I replied, genuinely surprised. I didn't realize you were keeping tabs on me. She smiled slightly. I make it a point to stay informed about people who have impressed me. You certainly qualify. A waiter appeared and we ordered. A salad for her, a sandwich for me. Once he'd gone, Eleanor folded her hands on the table and looked at me directly. I owe you an apology, she said simply. It was so unexpected that for a moment I couldn't respond. For what, specifically? I finally managed. For not seeing what was happening in your marriage. For prioritizing appearances over your well-being. For raising a son who believed it was acceptable to treat anyone, especially his wife, with such calculated cruelty. I blinked, trying to process this. In all my imaginings of this lunch, a genuine apology had never featured. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully. I'm not saying it to be appreciated, she replied, her tone matter-of-fact. I'm saying it because it's true, and because at my age, one becomes increasingly aware of the need to set things right while one still can. Our food arrived, creating a natural pause in the conversation. I used the moment to study her more carefully. She seemed different, less rigid somehow, though still every inch the society matron she'd always been. How is Daniel? I asked, not because I cared particularly, but because it seemed the expected question. Something flashed across her face. Sadness, perhaps, or resignation. Managing. His father pulled some strings to get him a position at a firm in Chicago. He's seeing a therapist at our insistence. Whether it's helping, she shrugged. He doesn't confide in me. I doubt he ever will again. I nodded, unsure what to say. I didn't wish Daniel ill exactly, but I couldn't pretend to care deeply about his recovery either. He's engaged again, she continued, watching me carefully for a reaction. To a woman from a suitable family. Her father is a federal judge. I felt nothing. No surprise, no jealousy, no concern for this unknown woman. Just a momentary hope that she was more perceptive than I had been. I hope they'll be happy, I said neutrally. Eleanor smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Oh, I doubt they will be. Daniel hasn't changed that much. She took a delicate bite of her salad. But that's not why I wanted to see you. Why did you then? She set down her fork and reached into her handbag, withdrawing a small velvet box that she placed on the table between us. These belonged to my grandmother. They should have been yours on your wedding day, but I held back. I told myself it was because I wasn't sure the marriage would last. The truth is, I didn't think you were good enough for them. For our family. She pushed the box toward me. I was wrong. I hesitated, then opened the box. Inside were diamond earrings, vintage, exquisite, and clearly valuable. I can't accept these, I said, closing the box and sliding it back. They're not a gift, Eleanor clarified. They're an inheritance. What should have been yours by right when you married into our family? The fact that the marriage ended doesn't change that they were meant for you. I shook my head. I don't want anything else from the Preston family. The divorce settlement was more than fair. This isn't about fairness or settlements. For the first time, her composure slipped slightly. This is about me attempting in some small way to acknowledge that you deserved better than what my son gave you, better than what I gave you. I studied her face, looking for any sign of manipulation or ulterior motive, but found only a straightforward kind of regret. Keep them for the next generation, I suggested gently. For a granddaughter who might appreciate their history. Eleanor nodded slowly, taking back the box and returning it to her purse. You're being extraordinarily gracious. Not gracious? I corrected. Just clear about what I want and don't want in my life now. We finished our lunch with surprisingly pleasant conversation. Eleanor asked about my job, my plans for the future. I inquired about her charity work. By the time the check arrived, which she insisted on paying, I realized I was actually enjoying myself. As we prepared to leave, she hesitated, then said, "There's one more thing. Something I thought you should know." I waited, curious. That day, at the firm, when everything fell apart for Daniel, she met my eyes directly. "I was proud of you. Horrified by the circumstances, devastated for what it meant for my son, but proud of how you handled it. The dignity, the precision. Even in your vengeance, you showed more class than my son ever did." I didn't know what to say to that. It was possibly the strangest compliment I'd ever received, yet oddly meaningful coming from a woman who valued propriety above almost everything else. "Thank you for lunch," I said finally, "and for the apology. I didn't know I needed to hear it until you said it." We parted with another awkward air kiss and a handshake that felt more genuine than any interaction we'd had during my entire marriage to her son. As I walked back to my office, I felt a strange sense of completion, as if a door I hadn't realized was still cracked open had finally clicked shut. That evening, I sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sunset paint the city in gold and pink. My phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Mark from the networking event last week. I enjoyed our conversation about financial literacy initiatives. Would you be interested in continuing it over dinner?" Mark, tall, with kind eyes and a genuine interest in my work rather than just my appearance. We'd talked for almost an hour about approaches to teaching financial independence to women leaving controlling relationships. He'd mentioned his own mother's struggle after his parents' divorce. I considered the invitation. 6 months ago, I might have declined automatically, still too focused on rebuilding myself to consider letting someone new into my life. But now, I typed back, "Dinner sounds good? How about Wednesday?" His response came quickly. "Perfect. Looking forward to it." I set down my phone and smiled at the sprawling sky. This wasn't about replacing Daniel or proving anything. It was simply about being open to possibilities again. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across my balcony. I thought about all the shadows in my own life, how they'd once seemed so threatening, how they'd stretched and distorted my perception of myself, and how, gradually, I'd learned to see them for what they truly were, proof of light existing somewhere else. As twilight settled over the city, I considered the journey that had brought me here. From the shattered bride who discovered her husband's betrayal, to the calculating strategist who dismantled his life with precision, to the woman I was now, stronger, wiser, unafraid of either darkness or light. He had laughed when I said "I do," treating my commitment as a joke and my love as a transaction. I had smiled as I took everything in the divorce, turning his betrayal into the seeds of my liberation. But now, watching the stars emerge one by one in the deepening blue, I wasn't laughing or smiling about the past at all. I was simply living fully and freely in the present I had created for myself. And that was the most complete revenge of all. 2 years to the day after I discovered the email, I found myself standing in the lakeside garden of what was once our vacation home but was now unquestionably mine. Champagne in hand, surrounded by friends, celebrating not my divorce. That party had happened long ago, but something infinitely more satisfying, my promotion to Chief Strategy Officer at the financial literacy startup that had taken off like a rocket. "To the smartest woman I know," Jason toasted, raising his glass, "who turned lemons into an entire lemonade empire." Everyone cheered while I mock-bowed, nearly spilling my drink in the process. The evening sun cast a golden glow across the water, turning the lake into a mirror of light. My lake. My light. My life. Mark slipped his arm around my waist, pressing a kiss to my temple. "They're not wrong, you know. You're kind of terrifying in the best possible way." I laughed, leaning into him. 8 months of dating, and he still looked at me with that mixture of admiration and genuine warmth that made my formerly cynical heart do embarrassing flippy things. He wasn't perfect, his socks never made it to the hamper, and he had an unhealthy obsession with documentary podcasts about shipwrecks. But he was real, honest, present. Most importantly, he knew everything. About Daniel, about the divorce, about the calculated dismantling of my ex-husband's life. I'd told him on our 3rd date, figuring if he was going to run, better sooner than later. He hadn't run. Instead, he'd asked thoughtful questions about how I'd moved forward, what I'd learned, how I'd rebuilt. Not once did he question whether my revenge had been justified. "Your friends throw a hell of a party," he observed, nodding toward where Mia was attempting to convince my normally reserved neighbor to try karaoke. "Bold of you to assume I had nothing to do with planning this," I replied, nudging him playfully. "Please. I've seen your idea of party planning. Everyone bring food, I'll supply alcohol, and we'll figure it out." "And has that approach ever failed me?" he pretended to consider. "Well, there was the time Jason brought 3 different kinds of hummus and nothing else. A minor nutritional imbalance that was corrected with pizza delivery." As the evening progressed, I found myself taking mental snapshots of the moments. Mia laughing so hard she snorted wine through her nose. My sister sprawled on the lawn with her kids, teaching them to find constellations. Mark deep in conversation with my former boss about investment strategies for nonprofit organizations. This was my life now. Not perfect, but perfectly mine. Later, after most guests had either left or claimed guest rooms for the night, Mark and I sat on the dock, feet dangling over the dark water. The May night was warm enough to be comfortable, but cool enough to justify sitting close. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he said, noticing my contemplative mood. "Just thinking about timelines," I replied. "How 2 years can change everything." "Regrets?" I considered the question seriously. "About leaving Daniel?" "Not a single one." "About how long I stayed?" "Many." "About how I handled the divorce?" I smiled into the darkness. "Zero," he chuckled. "That's my favorite thing about you, you know. Your absolute certainty once you've made a decision." "Is it? Because last week you said your favorite thing was my criminally underappreciated lasagna." "A man can have multiple favorite things," he protested. "It's not a zero-sum game." We fell silent for a moment, listening to the gentle lap of water against the dock posts. "I got an interesting email today," I said finally. "From Jessica." Mark raised an eyebrow. "The Jessica? Paralegal Jessica?" I nodded. "The very same. Apparently she's getting married." "To Daniel?" He looked genuinely shocked. "God, no." I laughed at the absurdity. "To some tech entrepreneur in Seattle. She's moving firms and wanted to, I don't know, clear the air." "Make amends?" It was part apology, part life update. "What did she say?" "That she was sorry for her role in what happened. That she'd been young and stupid and blinded by Daniel's attention. That she'd learned a lot about self-respect since then." I shrugged. "And that she'd heard good things about my work with the financial literacy program." Mark was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel about it?" "Surprisingly okay." I told her I appreciated the apology, but it wasn't necessary. That Daniel was the one who'd made vows to me, not her. And that I wished her well in her new life. "Very mature of you," he said, sounding impressed. "I'm full of surprises." I nudged his shoulder with mine. "Besides, it's easy to be magnanimous when you've already won." He laughed at that, the sound echoing across the water. "There's the woman I know and love." The words hung between us. Not the first time he'd said them, but significant nonetheless. Each time they felt less frightening and more like coming home. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "If this is a marriage proposal, I'm going to need you to up your game from sitting on a dock in the dark." I joked, masking a flutter of nervous anticipation. "Not a proposal." "Not yet," he squeezed my hand. "Just a question about the future." "I'm listening." "My company is opening a West Coast office. They've asked me to head it up." He turned to face me more directly. "It would mean moving to San Francisco." "Oh, not what I'd expected." "When?" 3 months. "It's a great opportunity, but..." He hesitated. "We haven't been together that long." "I know your life is here, your job, your friends, this place. I'm not asking you to uproot everything. Just to think about whether we might have a future worth exploring, whether here or there or somewhere else entirely." I looked out over the dark water, thinking about roots and movement and what it meant to build a life with someone versus for someone. "Can I think about it?" I asked finally. "Of course." He smiled, squeezing my hand again. "Take all the time you need." We headed back to the house a little while later, joining the last remaining party guests around the fire pit. As conversations swirled around me, I found myself in a contemplative mood, reflecting on journeys, both the one I'd completed and whatever might come next. 2 weeks later, I was working late in my office when my assistant stuck her head in. "Package for you," she said, setting a small box on my desk. "And your 4:30 canceled, so you're actually done for the day." I thanked her and examined the package. No return address, professionally wrapped. For a moment, paranoia flickered. Being on the receiving end of an elaborate revenge plot will do that to you, but curiosity won out. I opened it carefully. Inside was a small velvet jewelry box and a note. My heart did a strange stutter step as I opened the note first. "These belong to my grandmother. I respect your decision not to accept them before, but I hope you'll reconsider. Not as a Preston heirloom, but as recognition of your strength. Whether you keep them or sell them or throw them in the lake, they're yours by right. Eleanor." I opened the jewelry box. The diamond earrings sparkled back at me, beautiful and complicated, just like the feelings they evoked. Why now? Was this Eleanor's way of giving final closure? Some kind of admission that I'd truly been worthy all along? Or was it simply a woman in her 70s tying up loose ends? I closed the box and slipped it into my purse, not yet decided on what I'd do with them. The fact that I didn't immediately reject them said something about how far I'd come. That evening, as I considered Mark's job offer and Eleanor's gift and the path that had led me here, I found myself drawn to my laptop. I opened a document I hadn't looked at in over a year, the detailed timeline I'd created while planning my divorce strategy. It read like a stranger's life now. The meticulous notes on Daniel's schedule, the documented evidence of his betrayals, the calculated moves to dismantle his world piece by piece. I recognized the cold precision of it, the righteous fury that had driven every decision, but it felt distant now, like reading the battle plans for a war long over. I closed the file and opened a new one. At the top, I typed, "San Francisco possibilities." Then I began listing pros and cons, opportunities and challenges, questions and considerations. Not just about following Mark, but about what I truly wanted for my next chapter. Pro, new city, new opportunities. Con, leaving my support network. Pro, challenge of building something new. Con, giving up my hard-won territory here. Pro, being with Mark. Con, potential for history to repeat itself. I stopped at that last one, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Was that what I was afraid of? That by following a man to a new city, I'd somehow be repeating the pattern that had led me into Daniel's control? The comparison was unfair, and I knew it. Mark had never shown a single sign of being controlling or manipulative. He'd encouraged my independence, celebrated my success, and now was openly communicating about a major life decision instead of presenting it as a fait accompli. This wasn't about following a man. This was about choosing a path that might include one. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. "Mia, tell me you've eaten something besides those disgusting protein bars today," she said without preamble. "Hello to you too. And yes, I had a salad at lunch." "A real salad or just lettuce with sadness sprinkled on top?" I laughed. "A real salad, with chicken and everything." "Progress." She paused. "So have you decided about San Francisco?" Of course she knew. Mark had probably consulted her before even bringing it up to me, knowing how close we were. "I'm making a pros and cons list as we speak." "Very on brand for you?" I could hear the smile in her voice. "What's winning?" "It's complicated." "Because you're making it complicated," she said, her tone gentler. "Can I ask you something? Since when do you wait for permission?" "Fair point. Here's the thing. Are you hesitating because you're afraid of repeating the past, or because you genuinely don't want this?" I sighed. "How do you always know exactly what I'm thinking?" "Because I was there for the aftermath, remember? I watched you rebuild yourself from the ground up, and I get why the idea of following a boyfriend to a new city might trigger all sorts of alarm bells. But you're not the same person who married Daniel. You're not naive or isolated or financially dependent. You're a badass who took down her cheating ex like a chess grandmaster playing against a toddler. Whatever you decide about San Francisco, it will be your choice. And you can always unmake it if it doesn't work out." I let her words sink in, feeling something settle inside me. "When did you get so wise?" I asked. "Around the same time you got so indecisive. One of us had to step up." After we hung up, I went back to my list, but with a different energy. Instead of cataloging fears disguised as practical concerns, I focused on what I truly wanted. The truth was, I loved my job but wasn't wedded to this particular city. I valued my independence but also recognized that real strength came from making choices based on desire rather than fear. And I cared deeply for Mark, enough to at least explore whether we could build something lasting together. I picked up my phone and called him. "I've been thinking about San Francisco," I said when he answered. And I'd like to explore it. The job market, the neighborhoods, the possibility of us building something there. Not as a final decision, but as a serious consideration." The relief in his voice was palpable. I'd like that too. Very much. We talked for nearly an hour about practical details and exciting possibilities. By the time we hung up, I felt lighter, energized by potential rather than weighed down by past trauma. That night, I dreamed of Daniel for the first time in months. Not a nightmare, just a brief, mundane scene of him sitting at our old dining table, looking somehow diminished. He glanced up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not anger or resentment, just a hollow kind of recognition. I woke feeling strangely peaceful, understanding that he would always be a chapter in my story, but never again the author of it. 3 months later, I stood in an empty San Francisco apartment, watching the fog roll in over the city. The wall of windows faced west, promising spectacular sunsets on clear days. Behind me, movers were bringing in furniture, some from my apartment back east, some newly purchased for this space. I'd accepted a position with a venture capital firm specializing in women-led startups, negotiating a compensation package that made my previous salary look like pocket change. The lake house remained mine, a retreat I could return to whenever I wanted, a tangible reminder of everything I'd fought for. Mark's apartment was 15 minutes away, close enough for convenience, far enough to maintain our separate spaces as we navigated this new chapter. My phone chimed with a news alert, a profile of Daniel's latest legal venture in Chicago. The headline mentioned redemption and fresh start. I hesitated, then deleted it without reading. His story was no longer relevant to mine. As the last of the boxes were brought in, I opened the small velvet jewelry box that had sat on my dresser for months. Eleanor's earrings caught the afternoon light, scattering tiny rainbows across the empty walls. After a moment's contemplation, I put them on, not because they connected me to the Preston family, but because they represented a journey completed, a battle won, a life reclaimed. I caught my reflection in the window glass, a successful woman in a new city, wearing hard-earned diamonds in her ears and determination in her eyes. 3 years ago, he had laughed when I said I do, thinking he'd acquired a convenient accessory to his ambitions. 2 years ago, I had smiled as I took everything in the divorce, believing justice was the ultimate victory. But now, standing in the fading light of a city where no one knew my story yet, I understood the most complete triumph wasn't in what I'd taken, but in who I'd become. Someone who could wear her scars with grace, who could love without surrendering power, who could build a future unlimited by past betrayals. That was the real everything I'd gained in the divorce. Not assets or revenge or even justice, but myself. Whole, uncompromised, and finally, genuinely free. 5 years after D-Day, and San Francisco feels more like home than anywhere else I've lived. My corner office overlooks the bay, the fog rolling in and out like nature's own dramatic curtain. The venture capital firm promoted me to partner last year, my name now etched on the letterhead in sleek, permanent font. Life has a funny way of giving you exactly what you need, even when it arrives disguised as what you fear most. The email that shattered my world became the fault line from which everything better grew. My phone buzzes. Mark, texting to confirm dinner reservations. 3 years together, 2 living in the same apartment. I finally gave up the separate places once I realized independence doesn't require separate addresses, and he still treats date night like something special. Never takes for granted that I'll say yes. Always appreciates when I do. I send a quick confirmation and turn back to my computer, finalizing the funding package for a promising startup founded by a woman rebuilding her life after an abusive marriage. Our firm has developed something of a specialty in backing women with phoenix stories, those who've risen from the ashes of relationships or careers that tried to diminish them. Not because we're a charity, we're definitely not. Our return rates prove that, but because we've found that women who've survived personal apocalypses tend to build businesses with remarkable resilience. I would know. Mia calls as I'm wrapping up for the day. She's visiting next week, her 4th trip since I moved west. She's bringing her new girlfriend, which means I'll need to stock the guest room with the fancy coffee and those pretentious oat milk creamers she pretends not to care about. Just making sure you remember I'm allergic to all cheap wine now, she says by way of greeting. Since when? Since I decided your partner's salary means I never have to drink anything with a screw top again. It's a very specific medical condition. I laugh, locking my office door behind me as I head toward the elevator. I've already stocked the wine fridge with bottles pretentious enough to impress even you. That's why you're my favorite ex-revenge plotted friend. I'm your only ex-revenge plotting friend that you know of, she says mysteriously. We chat about her travel details as I walk to the car. San Francisco sparkles in the late afternoon sun, the city that welcomed me with no preconceptions, no history, no ghosts from marriages past. Oh, almost forgot, Mia says just before hanging up. Did you see the email from Jason? About the thing with Daniel? My steps falter slightly. It's been so long since I've thought about him in any meaningful way that the name feels foreign, like a word from a language I used to speak but have forgotten. No, what thing? Check your email. It's nothing bad, just interesting. Call me back if you want to talk about it. We hang up and I immediately open my email, curiosity piqued. Jason's message is near the top of my inbox, subject line, "Thought you might find this amusing." The link opens to a legal industry newsletter. There, in the middle of the page, is a small item announcing leadership changes at a mid-sized Chicago firm. Daniel Preston has been passed over for managing partner in favor of a younger associate. The blurb includes a quote from the firm's board about looking toward the future and fresh perspectives, corporate speak for, "We don't trust this guy with real power." I stand on the sidewalk, people flowing around me like water around a stone, and wait for some emotion to surface. Satisfaction, perhaps, or lingering anger, maybe even pity. Nothing comes. Daniel Preston is just a name now. A character from a previous chapter that has no bearing on the story I'm currently living. I close the email, put away my phone, and continue walking, the information already fading from relevance. That evening, over dinner at our favorite restaurant, the one where the chef knows us by name and always sends out some experimental dish for us to try, Mark notices I'm quieter than usual. "Everything okay?" he asks, refilling my wine glass. I consider deflecting, then remember one of the core promises we made early in our relationship: no strategic omissions, no convenient half-truths. After Daniel, I couldn't tolerate even the hint of dishonesty, and Mark had understood immediately. "I got news about Daniel today," I say. "Nothing dramatic. He was passed over for a promotion. 5 years ago, that would have felt like winning another round. Today, it just felt irrelevant." Mark nods, understanding without needing every detail. The final stage of moving on, complete indifference. Exactly. I take a sip of wine. It made me think about everything that happened. The person I was, the person I became during the divorce, and who I am now. "And what did you conclude?" I smile, thinking about the journey. "That revenge made me strong, but letting it go made me free." He reaches across the table, taking my hand. "To freedom, then." We clink glasses, and the conversation shifts to other topics. His latest project, my newest investment prospect, the weekend trip to Napa we've been planning. Daniel exists nowhere in these discussions, not even as a shadow. Later that night, as Mark sleeps beside me, I slip out of bed and move to the window of our high-rise apartment. The city lights sparkle below, a terrestrial galaxy of possibilities and paths. I think about the woman I was when I found the email, devastated, betrayed, but ultimately unleashed. The cold, calculating strategist who emerged from that devastation, meticulously dismantling Daniel's life with the precision of a watchmaker. The rebuilder who found her footing in graduate school and new friendships. The professional who carved out success on her own terms. Each version was necessary. Each served her purpose. But this version, the one standing here now, secure in her accomplishments, confident in her relationships, at peace with her past, this is the one I fought so hard to become. My wedding ring had long since been donated, but Eleanor's diamond earrings remain in my jewelry box. Not worn often, but kept as a reminder that strength can come from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the most surprising ally is someone who once dismissed you. Eleanor still sends a Christmas card each year, formal, proper, but with a genuine warmth that might have always been there, beneath the society matron exterior. She never mentions Daniel. I never ask. Some boundaries, once established, should remain respected. The light shifts on the bay as fog begins rolling in, and I think about what I would tell my younger self if I could send a message back through time to that Tuesday when everything fell apart. I would tell her that the pain is real but temporary, that the rage is justified but not defining, that revenge can be sweet, but redemption is sweeter. That losing everything you thought you wanted can sometimes be the path to finding everything you actually need. But most importantly, I would tell her that the man who laughed when she said, "I do," ultimately gave her the greatest gift possible, the opportunity to discover her own power. As I crawl back into bed, Mark stirs slightly, his arm automatically reaching for me. I settle against him, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the security of being with someone who sees me clearly and loves what he sees. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new triumphs, new moments of doubt and certainty. The future stretches before me, unwritten and full of potential. But one thing is certain: I am no longer defined by what was done to me, or even by what I did in response. The revenge story that once consumed me is now just that, a story. One chapter in a much longer, richer narrative that continues to unfold. He had laughed when I said, "I do," thinking he was cleverly trapping someone beneath him. I had smiled as I took everything in the divorce, believing justice was the ultimate victory. But now, years later, in the quiet darkness of a life rebuilt on my own terms, I neither laugh nor smile about the past. I simply live, fully present in a future that belongs entirely to me. And that, more than any revenge, is the most complete victory of all.